It's my pleasure now to introduce Elizabeth McAlister, who most of you, I think, already know. She is a longtime peace activist and peace resistor. She's a member of the Jonah House community in Baltimore, which is a community of people concerned with nonviolence. She herself has been in jail a number of times. She's the wife of Philip Berrigan. She has 3 children, and she's going to speak to us this evening on the arms race, then, now, and us.
Mostly I think it's going to be about us, because the other speakers have talked enough about then and now. One of the members of our community was at an event in Baltimore last week. And Baltimore, as you may or may not know, is largely a black city. One of the blacks got up and told this story. There was a meeting of physicians worldwide. They were talking about the advancements in medicine. An Israeli doctor got up and he said, in Israel, we have gone so far that we can take the leg from one soldier, put it on another soldier, have that soldier back fighting in 6 months. A German doctor got up and said, in Germany, we have advanced so far that we can take the brain from one scientist, put it in another scientist, have that scientist back at work in 4 months. British doctor stood up and said, in Britain, we have advanced so far that we can take the arm from one person, put it on another person, have that person back at work in 2 months. American doctor got up and he scratched his head and he said, well, in America, we've gone so far that we took an asshole out of Hollywood, put it in the White House, and no one's worked for 15 months. There's 11 adults in our community in Jonah House, and of the 11, 5 of them, for different periods of time, were what they call themselves paid professional killers. 3-4 years. World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And they have, for between 20 and 4 years, as have I, been unpaid amateur peacemakers, arrested and jailed many times, as I have been myself. So my perspective on both public events and the peace movement right now has been colored by the perspective of prison. H. Bruce Franklin, in an excellent book called The Victim as Criminal and Artist, calls the prisons and the universities the 2 main competing intellectual institutions in this society. So it's incumbent on me as a postgraduate of the one institution in this society that is not aligned with the military-industrial complex to try to say something intelligent. You remember that Thoreau used to speak about prisons as that separate but more free and honorable ground where the state places those who are not with her but against her. With regard to public events, I must say that there is an eternal consistency and coherency that I have seen. During the year 1980, our community sponsored a presence all year at the Pentagon, meaning that there were people there resisting the policies every working day of 1980. We called the campaign 1980 the year of election. Let's take our vote to the Pentagon. Not to the poll boxes, but to the Pentagon. And the consistency that that is important here is that we were saying in 1980, and we need to say now, we do have a choice. And that choice has nothing to do with electoral politics. It has to do with what do we do with our lives. In the electoral politics scene, Carter during his administration slashed $18 billion from social programs and projected $1 trillion in Pentagon spending over the next 5 years. Reagan went and slashed $48 billion and upped the Carter 5-year program by $600 billion. Carter approved production of the neutron bomb components. Reagan has ordered deployment. Carter commemorated Hiroshima and Nagasaki by issuing the Presidential Directive 59 on nuclear policy. Reagan commemorated these days by announcing his decision to deploy the neutron bomb. Carter proclaimed a willingness to use any means necessary in the Persian Gulf under the Carter Doctrine. What Reagan has done is rejuvenated a new and more deadly Monroe Doctrine. On and on. I think we've heard enough of statistics and information on the nuclear horror story, so I won't continue with that kind of specific. My purpose was only to highlight that in face of the kind of consistency and coherency we see in the Pentagon and in the administration, our lives need to reflect that same thing, except in the opposite direction. And in face of this, the response of the peace movement, I have to confess, has agitated and disturbed me in a way that Reagan has not. We expect this from Reagan. We don't expect it from one another. I'd like to paraphrase Martin Luther King in his letter from the Birmingham jail to say that by now I would have hoped that every thinking person would have understood that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice. And when they fail to do so, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I have reached the regrettable conclusion that the greatest stumbling block toward disarmament and turning away from the nuclear precipice upon which we now stand is not the Pentagon, but the good, tax-paying, law-abiding citizen who are more devoted to law than they are to justice, who prefer orderly, risk-free options. Sign a petition. To the tension and conflict that the fight for survival demand in our lives. There's something called the myth of time that operates in the movement to a distressing degree, especially vis-a-vis the taking of risk, or what has been known as civil disobedience. As a practitioner of that, I have heard year upon year upon year, now is not the time for direct action or civil disobedience. This is the time to educate people. You can't do civil disobedience unless people understand what you're doing. They've got to be educated. So now in 1982, that people are educated to the point that even conservative institutions like the church and the law and business are finding some voice with which to speak. We hear again, this is not the time for direct action and civil disobedience. It'll turn people off. The peace movement's been respectable. It's been made respectable. Well, I don't know if you hear these voices. I hear them all the time, and it's very distressing. For the strategists of peace, very different from peacemakers, and the lovers of comfort, the time is never right to confront or unmask injustice and indifference as it's expressed close to home. The time is never right to cross the police lines which protect the bomb. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And here I resonate again with King in his Declaration of Independence from the war in Vietnam. He said that his critics had never really known us, our commitment, or our calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they know nothing of the world in which we live. So as I speak of us tonight, I'd like to put first and foremost the whole issue of arrest. If we are alive today, we ought to know which side of the law the bomb is on. The design, the manufacture of these weapons is perfectly legal. Their use is perfectly legal. If the world is obliterated by these weapons, it will be perfectly legal. What does that say about the law? We have tested this question again and again and have yet to find a police person, a prosecutor, a judge, or a jailer who would say no when told to protect or carry out the orders of Rockwell International, General Electric, the Pentagon, the IRS, or the Commander-in-Chief. But that's irrelevant. Where do we stand? When do we say no? Gandhi said, "We seek arrest because the so-called freedom is slavery. We are challenging the might of this government because we consider its activity to be wholly evil." After what you've heard tonight, what you might know yourselves, I think we can safely declare the activity around the production, deployment, and use of these bombs wholly evil. Free life under this kind of government has become intolerable, for the price exacted for the retention of one's freedom is unconscionably great. It is 1982, and still precious few in the footsteps of Gandhi seek arrest against the tens of thousands who will sign petitions, work for local peace campaigns, lobby, write letters, carry placards in the streets. Professor Richard Falk, professor of international law at Princeton University, made this statement as a witness at a trial of friends in St. Louis. He said, "It is not accidental, in my view, that the only people who are standing straight in relation to the abuse of state power are standing on religious grounds. Because in some profound sense, the fundamental distress bound up in this nuclear national security state is one of idolatry." In our conversations with Professor Falk, he has made the plea that we cease calling civil disobedience civil disobedience. It is his view that that kind of activity is the most civilly obedient action, that anyone who understands the law, anyone who understands the dangers that this planet faces, the most civilly obedient action one can take. The question of arrest, most simply put, is whether the conscience or the state shall reign supreme in our lives. Throughout religious and political history, it is the institutions of the law that have forced false worship and demanded the submission of individual human conscience under pain of imprisonment or death. Cognition and feeling. Someone called me on a radio show out of Milwaukee the other night and said, "You're emotional, therefore we dismiss it." Cognition and feeling are essential prerequisites of action. We must both recognize the world in which we live and have some feelings about what we see. How can we act so as to protect life as long as there is time to do so? I would like to offer two perspectives on our world, the first an overview, the second a close-up, as motivations to the urgency of this kind of action today. Although I detest statistics, perhaps they are unavoidable in documenting our descent into the abyss of the violence of the latter part of the 20th century, which is a century of total war, mass exterminations, and impending nuclear holocaust. In World War I, called the Great War, there were 10 million dead, 20 million maimed, 20 million more orphaned. The world saw the breakdown of the traditional social order. But still, something was maintained of the distinction between military and civilians. Only 5% of the casualties of World War I were civilian casualties. Second World War. There's this Nazi aerial bombing of a small Basque town in Spain, and Pablo Picasso expressed a cry of outrage in his mural, the Guernica. 1937, the Japanese bombed Nanking, China. Listen to the protest message our government sent the Japanese over this bombing. Just listen, okay? This government, the United States of America, holds the view that any general bombing of an extensive area wherein there resides a large population engaged in peaceful pursuits is unwarranted and contrary to the principles of law and humanity. And yet, February 3rd, 1943, the United States and British bomber commands issued the Casablanca Directive, which targeted 58 German towns that had a population of over 100,000. Population centers, not military targets. In the Nazi bombing of Coventry, 100 acres were destroyed, whereas in the Allied bombing of Dresden, 6,000 acres were destroyed. I'm reminded of the words of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist, when he said about Nazi Germany, "Even if we lose, we shall win, for our ideals will have penetrated the hearts of our enemy." With the Casablanca Directive, Germany won the war. And we've been experiencing the effects of that ever since. Winston Churchill, with our full approval, promised that there would be no lengths in violence to which we will not go, and his Minister of Information declared his policy to be to bomb, burn, and ruthlessly destroy in every way available to us the people responsible for creating this war. 50 million people were killed, 48% of them were civilians. There have been more than 100 smaller wars since 1945 in which 50 million people were killed. Korea, 2 million killed, 84% were civilian, and nearly every city in the peninsula was leveled. In Vietnam, 2 million killed, 6 million maimed, 90% were civilian. We dropped 4 times the World War II tonnage of bombs, almost one 500-pound bomb for every man, woman, and child in that country. In November 1979, the Center for Defense Information identified 37 wars going on at that moment. My friends, I believe that Auschwitz, literally and symbolically, represents the outlook which is peculiar to the 20th century mind. Because it's the corporate, the scientific, the technical, or technological and bureaucratic mind. And it looks on human beings as a form of commodity to be used, controlled, and dominated in accordance with the needs of the state or science or industry. Auschwitz demonstrated that it was possible to create a society and a state in which every decision, including that which resulted in the murders of millions of people, could be arrived at through bureaucratic, rational detachment, with decision-makers physically and morally removed from the consequences of their actions. Auschwitz has shown us that it is possible, legally possible, to degrade and dehumanize people and then to discard them without compunction and with the tacit agreement of the majority of the population. Adolf Eichmann became a prototypical, if we can use that word, personality and conscience for the contemporary academician, Pentagon employee, military and corporate head. You will remember, I think, that after supervising the mass extermination of Jews, Slavs, mentally retarded, handicapped, homosexuals, political opponents, gypsies, and untold others, he escaped the Nuremberg trials and lived in South America till 1961, when he was brought to Israel for trial. It's an image out of my youth of him in that glass box in the courtroom. He protested he was not responsible. He was just a cog in a vast wheel. So they gave him psychiatric examinations. You know what they found? That this man was perfectly well balanced. He had good interpersonal relationships. His family life was exemplary. He slept well, no bad dreams, no problems, no guilt. Thomas Merton had this insight. He said, we equate sanity with a sense of justice, with humaneness, with prudence, and with the capacity to love and to understand another human being. And now it begins to dawn on us that it is precisely the sane ones who are the most dangerous. Because we seem emotionally, imaginatively, and morally unequal to the dangers confronting us. Gunther Anders, writing in 1955, called us the most divided, the most disproportionate, the most inhuman beings that ever existed. He said, the helplessness with which contemporary humankind reacts or rather fails to react, bespeaks a lack of freedom, the like of which never before existed in history. In every instance, in this lethal schizoid life around us, what we see as priorities are cost effectiveness, productivity, maximized profit, all of this over concern for humanity. The Industrial Revolution resulted in a massive overproduction. In 1941, massive overproduction and unemployment. People were no longer that necessary. So in 1941, the United States responded to this by putting 10 million human beings in uniform and putting them into a potlatch of destruction of peoples, cities, equipment, and industrial capacity of worldwide proportions. I'd ask you, please, to follow this a little closely. The specter of shrinking resources, the greed of expanding corporate capitalism and its search for newer, more profitable markets for exploitation and additional consumption, these were also part and parcel of the history of the Nazi era. Now we are again seeing these forces at work, exacerbated by the cybernetic revolution. And they are creating a crisis for the corporate elite, which can only be met with continued inflation, currency devaluation, massive exports of weapons, massive imports of drugs, support of dictatorships who will buy United States weapons and protect United States business, permanent unemployment, a massive prison population and system, and systematic executions. Right now there are 910 men and 10 women on death rows in this country. And human death through neglect, radiation, despair, repression, medical experimentation, and hazardous work and living conditions. A close-up. In 1977, 13 noted church leaders in Latin America wrote an open letter to North American Christians. And they said in part, "Our misfortunes flow from and are perpetuated within a system that produced benefits for your country, but which goes on swallowing up more and more of us in oppression, in impotence, and in death. In few words, it's your American way of life that's killing us." If we were to take, on a per capita basis, the 9,000 assassinations and brutal murders in 1980 alone in El Salvador, and transfer them into our country, we would be talking about 500,000 political killings in this country in 1 year alone. How would that impact on us? You know, Reagan calls the Caribbean a red lake, but the Soviet Union has never once invaded a Latin American country. But we have invaded 60 times in the last 90 years. I hear people who question with detached curiosity whether or not El Salvador will become another Vietnam. People who ask that kind of question don't understand Vietnam, or they don't understand El Salvador, or they don't understand either. And that ignorance is somewhat excusable. You know, a few years back, the American Friends Service Committee did a survey of 28 history textbooks used in our high schools. And every last one of them told the Nixon-Ford lies about Vietnam and treated the war in Vietnam as a little blip in international relations. So this is what's being fed at us. This is what is attacking our minds and the minds of our children and the minds of the generation coming after us. Our collective sanity again, is being systematically undermined by such public perversions of the truth. For those of us who claim to understand Indochina, who do have a sense of the scale of the massacres and repression now going on in Latin America, for those of us who understand the meaning of the corpses being washed up on the shores of Florida, Gandhi set forth 3 fundamentals of life. Life as it must be lived in a system ruled by force. The first of those is non-cooperation. In the foreword to his little book on Gandhi, Thomas Merton put it this way: a society that lives by organized greed or by systematic terrorism and oppression will always tend to be violent, because it is in a state of perpetual disorder and moral confusion. In such a system, the first valid political action becomes non-cooperation in its disorder, in its injustices, and more particularly in its deep commitment to untruth. I think that's where we have to be today. Non-cooperation with this government. The second principle Gandhi put down was renunciation of privileges. We might have that opportunity still, but down the line a piece, I don't think we will, because the days of privileges for most all of us are rapidly passing. And I'm referring to what we've witnessed in these last 15 months, besides everybody being unemployed. The elimination of everything that interferes with the few making great wealth. You know, and that whether we talk about the antitrust laws, they're gone. Conservation of land and resources, that's gone. Safety and occupational hazard regulations, they're gone. Environmental laws, labor unions, affirmative action, legal services, public broadcasting, oil gas regulations, and so on. I think you could add to the list. In 15 months, this man has eliminated what it's taken years and years and years to build up in this country. The corporate income tax has been nearly abolished. Representative Henry Roos, who's chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, called the recent tax bill a radical redistribution of income in this country away from moderate income to the top 10% of the people. So that this is government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. And it's based on the concepts of survival of the fittest, of lifeboat ethics, of triage. All of these are openly discussed. And all the victims, whether they be the sick, disabled, veterans, permanently unemployed, the elderly, the children, the poor, and the homeless, are blamed for their own suffering. These are the new inferior race, in the eyes of the rich and successful who are the new Aryan super race. In stark contrast, Ida Ford wrote before her assassination, "Am I willing to suffer with the people here, the powerless? Can I say to my neighbors, I have no solutions to this situation, I don't know the answers, but I will walk with you, search with you, be with you? Can I let myself be evangelized, that is, changed by this opportunity?" Archbishop Oscar Romero says that we who are in earnest in a commitment to justice must needs share the fate of the poor, or that so-called commitment to so-called justice is suspect. Conscience requires us to be on the side of the victims, and not because they are right, but because they are victims. The deepest experience of poverty and victimization that I have ever known has been in jail for acts of conscience. The third principle Gandhi laid out was that of resistance. To refuse military service is not enough. We have two responsibilities. One is a negative obligation, not to participate. The other is a positive obligation, to prevent the commission of these crimes. How do we act today so as to prevent nuclear war? I think that's the question that ought to be occupying our minds much of each waking day. I'd like to put before us, in closing, two contradictory consciences of our day. We've looked at one already, Adolf Eichmann, the sane man who oversaw the massacre of over 6 million people. The other is Claude Robert Eatherly. Washington Post gave, in part, this account of Claude Robert Eatherly's death in 1979. Claude Robert Eatherly used to wake up screaming because he helped to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. By his own account and that of relatives, his role in ushering in nuclear warfare remained the central episode of his life. As I speak of him, please keep in mind Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann. He died in the Veterans Administration Hospital in Houston, Texas, from cancer in 1979 at the age of 57. His brother James Eatherly said this of him: in the early 60s said this, "Every night for 15 years I have dreamed about it. I see great fires, boiling fires, crimson fires closing in on me, buildings full, children run, living torches with their clothes aflame. Why did you do it?" they scream. I wake up, paralyzed with fear, screaming, sweating, because I have no answer. He left the Air Force in 1947. His marriage ended in divorce. He lived some years in California and then returned to his native Texas. Major Eatherly was hospitalized several times for mental disorders. Insane. He was also arrested several times on charges ranging from armed robbery to forging checks. And the police who arrested him used to say that it was like he wanted to be caught and punished for these crimes. By early 1960s, he had become an outspoken pacifist and full of nuclear weapons. And the Washington Post ended it this way, and some questioned his patriotism. We have the burning conscience of Claude Robert Etherly, in polar opposition with Adolf Eichmann's sanity. A sense of conscience normally awakens in guilt, but that's the no-no today, huh? Don't ever feel guilt. Don't ever act out of guilt. That's what the psychologists tell us, huh? But guilt is the voice of conscience, and guilt, which is future-directed and healthy, casts off the intolerable burden of the past acts which one no longer sees as irreversible, and they strive to work for good. I mentioned at the beginning that 5 of the 11 people in my community were in military service, were paid killers. Those moments for each of them are moments from which they now turn around to try to build a life of acts of peace. One of them, a remarkable, self-effacing little guy named George Vesey, was a Vietnam vet who's crippled, his legs torn apart because he was sent to sweep a minefield and the mine blew up on him. He was arrested 3 times this past summer at the White House, right in a row. The judge says to him, "Mr. Vesey, I told you not to go back to that White House." You know what George said? Just scratched his head and said very simply, "Judge, last time I obeyed this government, I found myself killing women and children in Vietnam. I'm not obeying it anymore." Judge gave him 6 months for praying at the White House. He was one of 200 people arrested that June for that same action. 3 of the 200 were given 3 days in jail. All of the rest were given suspended sentences or 25 hours community service. George got 6 months because of that statement. Striving to work for good, seeing those acts of the past as not irreversible. Conscience is not individualistic, and it does not separate, but rather it seeks to create an identification between the individual and the human family. Conscience does not strive to approximate the divine or final judgment on humanity, but simply to represent mature human choice. Acts of conscience, acts of civil obedience, are but the implementation of each of our elemental responsibility to human life. The task before us, if we wish to reverse the arms race, is to learn how to act on conscience regardless of consequences, to learn how to live as free people, and to learn how to die as free people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you very much.